Hi there, I'm Alastair Campbell, and like a lot of people, I'm sitting at home wishing I wasn't. I think the most important thing is to not just develop strategy and execute the strategy, but you have to narrate the strategy as well. Because the thing about a crisis, I mean, people are always interested in what governments are up to some extent. But the thing about a crisis like this that is kind of affecting every single person in the world, there's that deeper level of interest and engagement. And you have to take people into your confidence if you're a government about what the decisions that you're making. And that's what I mean about narrating the strategy, is that the communications in a sense has to be embedded in the strategy. And that's why I think that, I think some governments have done that very well. I think the Germans have done it well. I think the standout for me on this in terms of purely as communications at a crisis has been Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. And I know whenever you say that, people say, oh, New Zealand, small country and not very densely populated, etc. They're making exactly the same decisions. And I think she made them quickly, effectively. She also had the standout. The other thing about crisis communications, one of the most sort of rules in that is get the big moments right. I think if I look at the UK, Boris Johnson's had 2 TV addresses that both actually ended up confusing people. Jacinda Ardern had the standout line for me of the whole crisis in terms of communications. When she was preparing the country to go into a quite strict lockdown, she said, I think I'm quoting this accurately, she said, New Zealand only has 102 cases, but so did Italy once. And that framed it. So I think you've got to have all the empathy as well. You've got to have that. I think Trump's been sadly lacking on that. You've got to have a strong team, and I think that they've been pretty mixed around the world on that. But I do think the single most important thing is this understanding that you don't just develop the strategy and execute the strategy, you've got to narrate it as well. I think they always want honesty, but I think that in a crisis, I really do think it becomes more important. And it's interesting, I've just been reading Der Spiegel, and I read this piece that was about Trump, Putin, Johnson, Bolsonaro. And it called them the 4 leaders of the infected world, which is pretty harsh. But if you think about it, what do they have in common? Let's be frank, they don't tell the truth. They don't think it's important to tell the truth. They underestimated, they deliberately downplayed the crisis. They gave a sense of their own national and personal exceptionalism. And they're the 4 worst affected countries in the world. And that will cost them when decisions are being made supposedly on the basis of scientific advice. Then you've got to know what that advice is. I wrote a book about that very theme, about winners and whether you can learn things from sport and business and apply them to politics and vice versa. And I do think actually some of the sports team leaders have an awful lot that political and business leaders can draw on in a crisis. Now, of course, it's to some extent it's easier because I guess that it's not as important on one level, but it's important to the people who are involved in it and the people who follow it. And the other thing is about a sports team is that if you're off the team, you're out. You have to go off somewhere else to play. Whereas in politics, people are always still hanging around. And that makes it important in a crisis like this. I think if I think about the UK government, for example, I think one of the really big failings strategically, as well as politically, has been the inability of the UK government and the UK Prime Minister to hold the 4 nations of the UK together. Now, Conservatives would say, oh, well, that's Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland sort of playing games and Mark Drakeford in Wales playing games. I don't believe that to be the case, actually. I think actually it's just that they have not, at the start of this, they did not think of the Scottish government and the Welsh government and the Northern Ireland executive as being part of the team. And so I think when you're talking about a team, the team operates on so many different levels. I mean, at the moment, every single person in the world is part of every country's team. I think it's been part of Angela Merkel's more effective leadership is that obviously you've got very different politics going on in the different Länder, in the German federal system. But she's kind of worked hard at making sure they try to work on this together, stay together. And I think those leaders that have done that, I think will come out of this better. I think the first thing to say when people are, if you like, at the center of a crisis is that it usually feels either better than it is or worse than it is. And you should just try to be in the zone that you need to be in, not the zone that's being created for you by others. I think the most important thing is to listen to the question and answer it. And the more important than any of that, though, is actually the preparation that you do before you're dealing with the media. It's actually about what you're going to say. It's not how you say it. I think the other thing is don't get spooked by it. I always say to people if they're sort of a bit worried about doing an interview, what is the worst thing that's going to happen here? You might say and ah a bit. The guy might annoy you, might get under your skin a bit. I mean, so what? I can't think of anything else in our lifetime that has had some sort of impact upon every organization and every individual in the world, large or small. For a lot of people, very, very large. And now, with that level of change around us, that means there's going to be, that change won't just sort of stop at a sudden point. That change is now going to be making other change, possibly for a generation. And therefore, that gives you opportunities to think, well, okay, that was how we did it then. How do we do that now? That was the mindset we used to adopt. Do we need to reset that now? And I think a lot of people will be using this kind of really strange time when we're all talking to each other like this. I think a lot of people, if they're sensible, will be thinking through those questions. One thing we never got right was having people involved in the team who were slightly separated from the actual crisis management and thinking about how we're going to get back on a normal footing. And I think it is really important to have somebody doing that function, because the natural thing to do when you feel you've got to throw everything at it is, like, say, so within a government, I want the 20 brightest people in a company say, right, I don't care what their job title is, get me the 5 best data guys now, I want to see them here now, tomorrow. And that's fine, but actually I think part of it should be to say, okay, well, we're never going to get back to the same normality as we had, but we're going to get back to a form of normality. When that happens, what are the new threats and what are the new opportunities? And I think actually that planning function is really important and often overlooked.